Good afternoon and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us, whether you're here in person or joining us on our YouTube station, and a special welcome to those of you watching us on C-SPAN. Elaine Weiss is with us today to tell us about her new book, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote. Before we hear from her, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up soon in this theater. On Tuesday, April 3rd at noon, Louis Galambos will be here to talk about his new biography, Eisenhower, Becoming the Leader of the Free World. Professor Galambos examines President Eisenhower's career and leadership in the post-World War world. A book signing will follow that program. And the next evening, on Wednesday, April 7th at 7, we'll host a discussion on Vietnam, the Combat Artist Program. Our partner for the evening is the National Museum of the Marine Corps. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events online at archives.gov. Check out our website or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives programs and activities. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach programs, and there are applications for membership also in the lobby. Our recent exhibit, Amending America, which closed last September, examined how the Constitution has been amended and demonstrated how high the bar is set to get a proposal ratified. Of the more than 11,000 proposed amendments, only 27 have become part of the United States Constitution. To us in the 21st century, it can seem unthinkable that the 19th Amendment, which guarantees women the right to vote, was in danger of becoming one of the thousands of failed amendments. But the fight to ratify the 19th Amendment came down to a do-or-die moment in the summer of 1920. In her review for the Christian Science Monitor, Marjorie Cahill wrote, Weiss wonderfully describes the drama in the Tennessee State House that day. Crowds packed into the visitors' gallery, the suffs draped in saffron, and the aunties wearing red flowers. And Gene Zimmerman, reviewing the book for NPR, wrote, Weiss brings a lucid, lively, journalistic tone to the story. Perhaps her greatest contribution is documenting the intricate, contentious element of racism that crippled the struggle. The story of the fight for the 19th Amendment reminds us that the events of history are not inevitable. The records we care for here at the National Archives contain the stories of our nation and its people, and we've learned to never be surprised by surprises. In fact, this is the first event of a kickoff of our Women in the Vote exhibit, which opens next March. So I'm pleased that you're here to kick off that program. Elaine Weiss is an award-winning journalist and writer. She's worked as a Washington correspondent, congressional aide and speechwriter, magazine editor, and university journalism instructor. Her magazine features writing has been Her magazine feature writing has been recognized with prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists, and her byline has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, New York Times, Boston Globe, Philadelphia Inquirer, as well as reports and documentaries for NPR and Voice of America. She's been a frequent correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor, and her long-form writing garnered a Pushcart Prize, Editor's Choice Award. She's a proud McDowell Colony Fellow also. Her first book, Fruits of Victory, The Women's Land Army in the Great War, was excerpted in the Smithsonian Magazine online and featured on C-SPAN and public radio stations nationwide. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elaine Weiss.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here at the National Archives, returning here. And as you know, it's the wellspring of knowledge for anyone who's interested or studies, or in my case, writes about American history and American government. The Archives collects and preserves and protects the documents that are the foundation of my work, from the sacred documents of our nationhood to the most mundane but perhaps very useful bureaucratic memos. And here are constructed the haystacks in which we search for those very valuable needles. And I just want to thank the Archives for being such important stewards of those documents. And the Archives is also the home of this very important document. This is Tennessee's certified ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And it's signed by Tennessee Governor Albert Roberts in August of 1920. This piece of paper, which is in Record Group 11, by the way, if you're keeping score, is the subject of my new book, The Woman's Hour. And I tell the story of this piece of paper, and the story of the men and the women who fought for the amendment's adoption, and also those who fought to keep it out of the Constitution, and why that battle was so fierce, and why it's so relevant today. It's a great, rollicking, bare-knuckled political tale. It's filled with colorful characters and twisty plot turns. It's a book about political power and political will. It's about racial and gender politics. It's about states' rights. And it's about the vote. And it's about democracy and our nation's rather ambivalent attitude towards that. It's the story of how American women and their demand for the vote, for the most sacred right of democracy, was once considered radical, crazy, subversive, impossible. But it was slowly and methodically transformed into something considered inevitable, or almost inevitable. The fight for women's suffrage is really one of the defining civil rights struggles in our nation's history. It's one that cuts to the heart of what democracy means. Who gets to participate in our government? Who has a voice? When we say we the people, what do we really mean? Do we mean everyone? And again, we're still asking those questions. And the Women's Hour chronicles the explosive climax of that struggle during one hot summer in 1920 in Nashville, Tennessee. It's a political thriller of sorts with strong, complex women in the starring roles. And you don't see that all too often. Women as activists, women as savvy politicians, not just historical footnotes. It's a tale of suspense with double crosses and dubious motives and many betrayals. And if I've done my job in the book, you'll forget that you know the outcome. The book is built upon documents, thousands of them, letters, memos, receipts, reports, journals, contemporary newspaper articles, scribbles in the margins. And like any researcher working with primary documents, I've learned to decipher impossible penmanship, actually this is pretty good penmanship, and archaic references, and even read sideways and upside down when necessary. But it's worth it, because seeing the handwritten or hand-typed documents proves very, very revealing. Seeing the underlinings, the scribbles, the cross-outs, the capitalization, even the punctuation marks help understand the characters much better, their personalities, their motivations, even their quirks. And it helps to piece the story together. Now, if you're like me, and I'm not a suffrage scholar, you've had only a really fuzzy idea of how American women won the vote. And that active verb, won, is important. They were not given the vote. They had to fight for it, and they eventually won it. And that kind of fuzzy notion goes something like this. A bunch of women meet in a place called Seneca Falls, and they're all wearing hoop skirts and bonnets, and it's very picturesque. Then fast forward a bit, and some women are holding placards and picket signs, and soon American men see the light and offer the vote to their wives and mothers and daughters and sisters. It's the march of progress. It's just a natural evolution. It just happened. No, that's not how it was. It required 3 generations of fearless activists working over 7 decades to secure the vote for American women. And the culmination of that crusade, what we call the women's suffrage movement, comes down to a fierce 6-week battle in Nashville, Tennessee. In the summer of 1920, one last state was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving all women in all states, in all elections, the right to vote. 35 states had ratified, and 36, or 3/4 of the 48 states then in the Union, were needed for ratification. Tennessee could be the 36th. If the Tennessee legislature approved the amendment, it would become the law of the land before the 1920 presidential election. If the amendment failed in Tennessee, it could be delayed indefinitely and perhaps not enacted. And those of us who've watched the ERA amendment not be enacted can understand that there was a sense of urgency. The enfranchisement of half of the citizens of the United States was at stake, and it all came down to Tennessee. Now, by 1920, when the book takes place, the suffragists had been fighting for the vote for 72 years. Since that first outrageous demand for the vote was made by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and seconded by Frederick Douglass at that Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in 1848. And this is a Harper's Magazine illustration of that meeting. Now, many of those attending the meeting, including the great reformer Lucretia Mott, thought that asking for the vote was a terrible idea. It was too risky. It was radical. It was ridiculous. But Frederick Douglass stood up and said, you must demand equality. You will not be given it unless you demand it. And he really becomes a hero of the book. He calls himself a woman's rights man for all of his life, and he truly is. He is a great champion. Now, Douglass and the women we know as the early pioneers of the suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, have been working together for years as abolitionists. These women that we know as the foremothers actually cut their political teeth as abolition organizers. And the idea of women's rights, the right to vote being just one of those, really grows out of the themes of the abolition movement, that of the idea of natural rights and personhood. And so the abolition and women's rights movements are sibling movements through the Civil War. And they are, the suffrage women form something called the Women's National Loyal League, and that is the first national political organization of women in our nation, in our history. And they push Abraham Lincoln to proclaim the Emancipation Proclamation and to push Congress to pass the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. So they fully expect that after the war, universal suffrage will be enacted for Black men and all women. But they are sadly disappointed because they're told after the war that the nation cannot handle two great reforms at once. Yeah, limited attention span. And their abolitionist brothers desert them. Frederick Douglass tells them that the Black man needs the vote more desperately, and that is absolutely true. It is a matter for us of life and death, he says, as the Reconstruction era violence erupts and Black men are being lynched. It is not the woman's hour, Frederick Douglass and the other abolitionists tell the women. The women's hour will come, but it must wait. And that is where the title of my book comes from. There's a heartbreaking split between the movements. Stanton and Anthony refuse to support the 14th and 15th Amendment because women are excluded. And for the first time, the word male enters the Constitution. It says male citizens shall not be denied the vote. And Stanton says, if that word male be inserted in the amendment, it will take us at least a century to get it out. She's not quite right. It takes over 50 years. In anger, Stanton and Anthony express vile and racist sentiments against Black and immigrant men who are not as well educated as they are. And they say, why should they have the vote before women like us? And it took years to heal the breach, but it was healed. However, racism in the movement was never fully resolved, just as it's not been resolved in the rest of our national consciousness. It was a painful moment for the extraordinary 50-year partnership between Stanton and Anthony. I forged the thunderbolts and she hurled them, is the way Elizabeth described their working together. Stanton was thought and Anthony was action. And that action included Susan Anthony defying the law and voting in the 1872 presidential election, testing the legal theory that as a citizen, she inherently already had the right to vote, and she just had to exercise it. I have been and gone and done it, she wrote gleefully to Elizabeth in New York. She was soon arrested, put on trial, and convicted of illegal voting in a federal election. And here's, again, a description. This is called The Woman Who Dared. And she goes around New York State giving lectures, asking, is it a crime for a US citizen to vote? And of course, that's a question we can still ask. Now, the failure of this voting experiment, and 150 women besides Elizabeth Stanton, besides Susan Anthony, including Sojourner Truth, tried to vote in that 1872 election. And the failure of this experiment led Elizabeth and Susan to draft a constitutional amendment which would supersede state laws. And would be based on the 15th Amendment, just saying simply one sentence, the right of the citizen shall not, rights of the citizens to vote shall not be abridged or denied by the United States or any state on account of sex. It was introduced into Congress in 1878, and it was stalled there for 40 years. Every year, the suffragists would go up to Capitol Hill and testify. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton describes one such incident where she is reading her testimony and the senators are sharpening their pencils, they're clipping their nails, they're eating their lunch, they're reading the newspaper, anything but concentrating. And she says she has to restrain herself from throwing her manuscript of testimony at their heads. And every year, it would be thrown into the dark recesses of a cabinet somewhere. The amendment was voted down in either committee or on the floor of the House and Senate 28 times. And so the suffragists, while it's stymied in Congress, go to work in the states, which can confer suffrage to its citizens. And in the following years, tens of thousands of dedicated suffragists will be waging 900 local, state, and national campaigns to win the ballot. They traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony described it, organize, educate, and agitate in tiny towns and big cities across the nation. Here's some wonderful pictures of them going out on the road. Now, they were pelted. They had to endure contempt and ridicule in their communities, their churches, in the press. And here you see some of the images that they had to look at. They were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. They were attacked by mobs of angry men and boys. They were denounced as radical, perverts, traitors, anarchists, bad wives and mothers, even Bolsheviks. They were described, again, here are some of the, get a sense of the anxiety about women going out to vote. They are derided as unattractive, unsexed she-men. And the men who support them, I think you can guess which one's supposed to be the suffragist here. The men who support them are belittled as Mabels and Nancys. And clearly, many men and some women are very frightened. Do we see a theme emerging here? I think we do. It's hard for us to imagine how brave a woman had to be to stand up and speak out in support of political equality. They had to change hearts and minds before they could change the law. And they had to change the stereotype of women's role in society. And that's a hard thing to do. And I think you'll agree, they're sort of the original She Persisted. It was a stupendous feat of organization without any of the travel or communication tools that we take for granted today. When you think of it, the movement begins in the mid-19th century. Passenger train travel was really in its infancy. The telegraph had only recently been invented. There's no typewriter. There's no telephone. Of course, those inventions come about, and they are certainly used by the suffragists. But even in 1920, when my book takes place, the radio is not yet in use. As one young woman in my publisher's office who read the manuscript said, "I don't understand how they could do all this organization without Facebook." But they did. They held meetings and rallies and demonstrations, and they marched, which was not considered proper for women to do. They didn't wear pink pussy hats, but they did wear their marching costumes, white dresses with yellow sashes. And here you see some wonderful marching photographs. Now, sometimes they got a little carried away with those marching costumes. As you can see, they sort of like to dress up a bit. Now, the first national suffrage parade was held here in Washington in March of 1913. It was on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, and there was a grand procession of 8,000 women down Pennsylvania Avenue with 26 floats, 9 bands, and women on horseback. The men watching were incensed. This is not how women were supposed to behave. They were not supposed to be making political demands in public. Mobs of men and boys closed in on the marchers. They grabbed their banners, tore them, threw them to the ground, threw the women to the ground also, ripped their clothes, and stomped on them. Police stood by and just watched the assaults. Federal troops had to be called out. There was a congressional investigation, but no one was punished. But the suffragists didn't just march, and this is an important point. They built sophisticated advocacy organizations. They learned to petition, to draft legislation, to lobby, to campaign, all before they had the right to vote and have any representation. They created elaborate lobbying enterprises here in Washington and in the state capitals. On Rhode Island Avenue was something called Suffrage House, which was the suffrage headquarters for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the largest mainstream suffrage group in the country. And there was also another lobbying headquarters at the National Women's Party, and their office was on Jackson Place. And again, now by 1914, 15, 16, the suffrage movement has split. There are two rival factions after the same goal, but they are divided in how they're going to approach it in their strategy and in their tactics. And so they work in parallel and sometimes trip themselves up. And each of them maintained elaborate card index systems with information on every member of Congress. His stand on suffrage, of course, but also his friends, his enemies, his donors, his vulnerabilities, the skeletons in his closet. And I say his because there's only one woman in Congress at that time, Jeanette Rankin from Wyoming. And you can actually see these card indexes that the Women's Party maintain at the Belmont Paul House, just a few blocks away from here. Now, World War I comes about in 1917, and it brings new tensions and new opportunities to the movement. Many suffragists worked hard to prove their patriotism, like these Brooklyn Suffrage Association sharpshooters, who are trying to prove their patriotism, their support for the war, and the idea that they deserve the vote. And women undertook war work that had never been done by women before. And again, they're proving their patriotism, their citizenship, and strengthening their demand for the vote. But not all suffragists worked for the war. Alice Paul and her Women's Party would not place war work over suffrage work. And they picketed the White House, asking, how can we be fighting a war to make the world safe for democracy when half of our nation's citizens have no democracy, have no vote? And they have this banner, democracy should begin at home. They picket the White House and burn the president in effigy. They keep a watchfire at the gates of the White House for months and months in rain and shine and snow. They even call Wilson Kaiser Wilson, which was very provocative and very controversial. Hundreds were arrested and served time in prison for their civil disobedience in the fetid Occoquan prison in Virginia. They were held in decrepit, vermin-infested cells. They were physically assaulted, clubbed, tied to the wall, not allowed to read, write, or even speak to one another. They communicated by singing. When they refused to eat, they were force-fed with tubes rammed down their throat. Alice Paul was held in solitary confinement, and to break her, she was threatened with commitment to St. Elizabeth's Asylum. Of course, the doctors could find nothing wrong with her. They didn't break her. But when the suffrage prisoners were released, they toured the country in copies of their prison uniforms made by a seamstress in what they called the prison special. And they brought the story of their imprisonment and their torture, in some cases, around the country to tell America what was going on, how they were being punished for demanding their rights. And here are pictures of the women on the prison special. We're going to go back a second. When the war comes to a close, the suffragists push hard to win congressional passage for the amendment, and they finally succeed in June of 1919. And now it goes out to the states for ratification. And a year later, in summer of 1920, the amendment was on the cusp of victory, or possibly defeat, when it arrives in Tennessee. Because Tennessee was a dangerous place to stage this definitive battle for the amendment. Nearly all the other southern states had already rejected the 19th Amendment for very racist reasons. They did not want Black women to be able to vote. And the Suffs faced an uphill battle in Tennessee, and they knew it, but they had little choice. It was their last best hope. So all the forces for and against women's suffrage, all the arguments that have been made for 70 years, gather in Nashville, and the campaign generals arrive in their picture hats and white gloves. The national suffrage leader, Carrie Chapman Catt, who is the anointed heir of Susan B. Anthony. She's Anthony's disciple. Anthony has trained her and groomed her to lead the movement. She arrives from headquarters in New York to take command of this pivotal battle. Then there's young Sue Shelton White, who is a native Tennessean, and she returns home to lead the campaign for the Women's Party, the more radical wing of the movement. She represents that young, third-generation suffragist who's impatient with just asking for the vote. She's demanding the vote, and she will lead the campaign of the Women's Party in her native state. And then there's Josephine Anderson Pearson, the leader of the Tennessee women opposed to women's suffrage. And she promised her dying mother that she would fight the scourge of women's suffrage if it ever reached Tennessee. So she arrives from her home in the southern mountains of Tennessee to defend her home state from what she calls the feminist peril. And they were joined by more than 1,000 men and women from across the state and around the nation, suffragists, anti-suffragists, governors and senators, corporate lobbyists, journalists, and nervous legislators, all gathering there to enter the fray. There were powerful forces at work opposing ratification in Tennessee, political, corporate, and ideological foes who each had their own reason for opposing the amendment. Politicians and political parties who feared this unpredictable large voting bloc which was going to enter into elections, and no one knew how they were going to vote. And some politicians began to get a little nervous about whether they'd be attractive to women candidates. Clergymen who believed that women voting went against the will of God. It went against God's plan because he or she made Eve to be subservient to Adam. And so women had no right to ask for any kind of political power. And so they used biblical arguments to refute the ideas of women's suffrage. And then there are corporations who are against women's suffrage. They believe it will be bad for business. Textile manufacturers, for one, who are afraid that women voters will insist on abolishing child labor. And they rely on child labor because it's cheap, and they don't want any interference with that. The liquor industry, who fears women voters because even though prohibition is already in effect in the summer of 1920, they're hoping it won't be enforced very rigorously. And they're afraid if women who tend to have sort of temperance leanings will have a vote, they're going to insist that those prohibition laws be enforced. So they don't want women voting. Also, the railroad industry is a strong opponent of women's suffrage. The liquor lobby is so nervous that they sponsor a speakeasy on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel, which is right next to the State House in Nashville. And it's called the Jack Daniels Suite because it dispenses liquor morning, noon, and night to any legislator who finds his way up there and willing to listen to an argument of why he should reject the 19th Amendment, if he could still stand up. And there are wonderful accounts of these legislators warbling down the hallway, singing, "Keep the home fires burning," and then having to be sobered up under showers and fans to get them ready to go into the chamber. But the most passionate foes of the 19th Amendment turned out to be women themselves. And that women might oppose the enfranchisement of their sisters was really shocking to me. Some of the anti-suffragists were sophisticated and well-educated women. Some of them will surprise you, like the muckraking journalist Ida Tarbell. is a vociferous foe of women's suffrage, and it actually is an officer in the National Anti-Women's Suffrage Organization. Also, this might surprise you, Eleanor Roosevelt is not an anti-suffragist, but she's not a supporter of suffrage. And she seems so ambivalent that the anti-suffragists try to court her and try to make her one of their own. Some antis, or antis, whichever you want to pronounce it, argued that women would be sullied by contamination with political life, even just by voting. And they might lose the soft power, the soft suasion of influence that they already had. And many others were social and religious and cultural conservatives who feared that suffrage would bring about a profound and unhealthy shift in gender roles. It would endanger the American home and bring about, in their words, the moral collapse of the nation. It would alter private, not just public life. And this is what made it so frightening. And here's this wonderful anti-suffrage broadside, which has the caption, "A vote for federal suffrage is a vote for organized female nagging forever." You can see how frightening this is. And this is also an important reminder that the debate over women's suffrage for all those years was never just a political argument. It was also a social and cultural, and for some, moral debate about women's role in society. And in that way, it's a precursor to what we call the suffrage wars, those complex, multi-layered public policy decisions. So all sides confront one another in Nashville, and it gets wild. There are bribes and booze, propaganda and blackmail, conspiracies and kidnappings, fistfights, betrayal and courage. The newspapers call it suffrage Armageddon. And the outcome remains in doubt until the very last moment. And I won't spoil it for you. But it does come down to a single vote of conscience from the youngest member of the legislature of Tennessee, who receives a letter from his mother. Now, all this took place almost a century ago. But I think you'll find The Woman's Hour is a book of history with surprising and perhaps even unnerving modern themes. It helps explain where we've been and where we are today. It deals with topics that dominate our headlines right now: voting rights and voter suppression, women's rights, inequality, dark money in politics, the role of religion in public policy, and racism. Because the history of suffrage in America is inevitably a story about race. In Nashville, there are cries of white supremacy and states' rights. The Ku Klux Klan is invoked as a dog whistle. And the Confederate flag is waved in defiance. Here's a picture of anti-suffrage headquarters. That's Josephine Pearson on your right, and a Civil War veteran in the middle. Again, the stars and bars are being held, and you'll see that there's a banner that says the Forrest Veterans. That's Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. This is a very symbolic photo. They know exactly what they're doing, and this is distributed to show the power of the women anti-suffragists. And of course, we've been hearing echoes of all those cries very recently. And, oh, did I mention that the story unfurls in the midst of a bitter presidential election campaign, where the campaign slogan for the Republican candidate, who is a notorious womanizer and is being blackmailed by one of his mistresses and has paid hush money to keep her silent, is America First, Warren G. Harding. I don't write fiction. I submitted the manuscript for this book after working on it for 4 years, on the day before Election Day, 2016. Yeah. I pushed the send button, because that's how you send manuscripts to your editor these days, and it flew through the ether to the inbox of my editor in New York, and she replied, "Hurrah, great timing." Well, it was more timely than we could have known. By the next evening, the national landscape had changed, and in the months that have followed, the national psyche has changed. And the story I wrote about the suffragists' long fight for democracy and the final battle in Tennessee has taken on layers of meaning I could not have anticipated. This story of ordinary women, grassroots activists that they were, taking to the streets and demanding change, assumes a new resonance as millions of men and women and young, brave students join marches to protest government policy today. And this tale of women standing up and demanding that their voices be heard and their complaints be taken seriously echoes loudly as women rise up to say "Me Too" and "Time's Up." And this history of citizens fighting for their rights enters a new dimension as rights they thought or they assumed were secure: voting rights, citizenship rights, press freedom, women's rights, appear to be endangered once again. On Election Day 2016, having handed in the manuscript, I learned a lesson about the powerful legacy of the suffragists about whom I had just written a book. On that day, thousands of women around the country were casting their vote, and if you might remember, a woman was running for the presidency, and then they made pilgrimages to the gravesites of the suffragists who had won that vote for them. And they placed flowers and thank you notes and their "I voted" stickers on the graves of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Carrie Chapman Catt in New York, on Alice Paul's grave in New Jersey, and in Rochester, New York, where Susan B. Anthony is buried. More than 10,000 people, men and women and children, visited her grave, and here's a picture of what it looked like that day, thanking her for her fight for democracy. I think there were important lessons to be learned from the fight for women's suffrage: that social change is slow and political change is hard, and that the struggle to expand our democracy is ongoing, that reform movements are imperfect. The story of women's suffrage is both an inspiring and a cautionary tale. It's complicated, it's messy. There were moral compromises made by the suffragists to win. They're willing to leave their Black sisters behind. And I hope the story that I tell in the Women's Hour will teach a new generation of activists that protest is patriotic and necessary, but it must be followed up by well-designed and sustained political strategies. The suffragists did not just march and picket. They debated, they lobbied, and they campaigned. The vote is a prayer, as Carrie Catt described it. The vote is power. And today, our job is to protect that vote for all citizens. And it's our sacred duty to use that vote to help expand and improve our democracy. That's what the suffragists can teach us, and I hope you'll enjoy reading about them. Thank you very much. Thank you. Questions? Love to hear questions. Please go up to the microphones. Entertain anything.
How instrumental do you think it was when the women joined the military in the First World War, when they served as nurses in the Marines and such? I know it made a very big difference to President Wilson.
Yes.
But to the rest of the mindset of men in the country, could you elaborate upon that?
Yes, the World War I, women's service in World War I was a very big part of a sort of change of heart and mind among American men. And remember, it's American men who are making this decision at all levels, whether it's in the Congress or in the legislatures to be ratified. It's men deciding if women deserve the vote. So they have to be convinced. And one of the strategies of the mainstream suffragists is to make sure that America knows how much American women are willing to sacrifice to help their nation. So they do join the military, those services that would allow them to. They take on extraordinary jobs that are considered men's work. And actually, my first book is about the women who serve in World War I, specifically who take over the farming for the men and organize themselves in a non-governmental body called the Women's Land Army. So the suffragists pump out, they have a very sophisticated public relations desk in New York that pumps out stories and press releases highlighting what women are doing to serve in World War I. And it certainly makes a difference to Woodrow Wilson, to quite a few congressmen, and also just the general public. Women are raising money because, again, the war was financed by Liberty Loan drives, and they're raising money, they're volunteering, they're knitting socks and all those Red Cross rolling bandages, but they're also doing they're taking on new roles. And this makes men kind of realize that women have to be seen in a different light. So yes, I think it is very important. Yes.
Oh, yeah, thank you. It was a great presentation. And I have a question about whether you are working on a sequel on the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment. A lot of people don't realize it's still alive. There was something you probably know recently. It got voted down in Virginia with mainly the argument that the time limit is passed. But I know our senator in Maryland, Cardin, has introduced a bill to remove the time limit, which is reasonable, and now it's potentially going to be voted on in Arizona. So do you have any? I think that would be a great sequel for you to put together with all this battle going on.
It would indeed. It's interesting. You might be interested to know that the Equal Rights Amendment is drafted by the National Women's Party, Alice Paul's group.
Yes.
Sue Shelton White, the woman who's there leading the campaign for the Women's Party in Tennessee, becomes a lawyer, her lifelong dream. And she and Crystal Eastman, who is also an attorney, and Alice Paul, who has also a legal degree, draft what we know as the ERA, and it's introduced in 1923. So it is the direct sequel of coming out of winning the vote. I don't have any plans right now, but you might be able to convince me, yes.
Yeah, well, I think it would be great to get some of that information out into the public now with everything happening, because a lot of people, it's completely off of their radar.
Yes. Yes, it is. Now, I should say that the Equal Rights Amendment, when it was introduced and for decades afterward, was really quite controversial, and many suffragists did not support it.
Exactly.
Because it would take away protective legislation, especially labor legislation, that they'd worked hard to protect women in factories and things like that. So it was not a sort of slam dunk feminist ideal at the time, and women like Carrie Catt and even Eleanor Roosevelt do not support it.
Yeah, so. But even now there are areas, I don't want to go on too long, but I have a relative in the military where there is a discrepancy because at his level he has to meet physical standards that a female of the same rank would not have to meet. So that's a great argument for why we need an Equal Rights Amendment for everybody. Anyway.
Thank you.
But great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Sounds like a great book. I'll have to get it.
Yes, yes.
But I just have a question. If you could talk a little bit about how they were funded. Where did they get money? They didn't have jobs, you know?
Yes, that's actually a great, and there is new, I think there's actually a new book on, or there was a presentation I'm trying to think where it was, just recently about funding the suffrage movement. I talk about that a lot in the book. There are wealthy women who support the movement. One woman in particular who is a favorite of mine is Mrs. Miriam Leslie, a publisher in New York, who inherits Leslie's Illustrated Weekly, a very famous 19th century publication. And when she dies in 1914, she gives her entire fortune, which is $2 million, to Carrie Catt personally, to spend in behalf of women's suffrage. And that's a huge amount of money. And that becomes the nest egg that helps both fund this ratification campaign for her organization. It also is the seed money for the League of Women Voters, which, by the way, is the successor of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And it's Carrie Catt's dream, and it's her organization that she envisions. And it also goes to help other countries in their suffrage fights. So I was tracing the money, and that's actually how I found this story. But they're heartwarming, if you go through the National Women's Party files, as I did, you'll find nurses sending 20 cents, or a poor woman in Idaho saying, I have $1 and I'm sending it to you. So there's a lot of very small, heartfelt coins and bills that are put in envelopes and sent to headquarters. So it's both the large, Alva Belmont is another famous woman suffrage supporter. So there's big money, but there's also grassroots money, and that's really important. So it's an interesting model. It's an interesting model for today.
Hi. I am wondering where the word suffrage comes from. What does it mean?
Yes, great question. I had to look this up myself. It's a kind of funny word when you think of it. It comes from Old French and I'm sure Latin before that, which meant an intercessionary prayer. And so it's used in church language. And it evolves into a sense of an asking for not a favor, but for some voice in decision making, and it comes to mean a vote. So it's a funny circular evolution. But I do want to give my little history lesson on difference between suffragette and suffragist. In America, they are not suffragettes. We've all watched a little too much Mary Poppins. Suffragette was a demeaning term made up by a reporter for the Daily Mail in London in 1906 to make fun, using the diminutive, to make fun of the suffragists there, especially the more militant ones. And there they were militant, here they were not. And he uses it to make fun. And some suffragists over there say, okay, we're going to take this as a badge of honor. And they use it. And of course, the press on both sides of the Atlantic uses it. But the suffragists here never call themselves that. It's suffragist. So that's my little lesson. I had to teach my, everyone who's connected with the book to not use the suffragette. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so very much. I appreciate it.